Good evening, everyone. I'm really pleased to welcome you to this evening's event, marking the 25th anniversary of the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of the Child. My name is Rachel Rosen, and I'll be chairing the event this evening. I've spoken with many of you on email, so it's wonderful to see you here tonight. The event is being hosted by the Department of Childhood, Families and Health, and we're made up of two research-intensive units. The Thomas Coram Research Unit has 40 years of research excellence and carries out research related to children and young people in their families and outside of their families, so in healthcare settings, in education, and social services. The other research-intensive unit that makes up the department is the Social Science Research Unit. And at the unit, which has been around since 1990, we engage in critical and participatory social research aimed at influencing evidence-based policy, and always from a human rights and social justice perspective. Based at the Social Science Research Unit is a thriving childhood stream of research. And as part of this work, there's a long history of research, of teaching and doctoral supervision within the childhood and children's rights, including a Master's of Sociology of Childhood and Children's Rights, which I'm very pleased to be the program leader on. But we have the two of the founding members, Priscilla Alderson and Barry Mayall, who's hiding at the back over there, who have contributed incredibly to this realm of research and to making the MA thrive. And I'm talking about the MA because I'm going to do a shameless plug right now. If you don't already know about it, the MA is running. We are recruiting for our Children's Rights and Practice module in the springtime, and for the MA overall starting in spring or fall, or autumn. Sorry, that's outing me as a North American. Autumn. Anyway, let me move on to tonight's event. Our event tonight is marking the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of the Child, and as many of you will know, this is the most rapidly and widely ratified international human rights treaty in history. And its adoption by the UN General Assembly in 1989 represents the product of many years prior to that of debate, discussion, deliberation, and sustained effort. The convention has been called a radical document, and it's been credited with changing the way that children are both viewed and treated. The convention is often associated with broader shifts in relation to childhood at global and local levels, shifts that assert that children, even the very young, even infants, children are not just passive objects or human becomings, but that children must be recognized as human beings with rights not only to protection and provision, but to participation and citizenship. So it's a very radical document in those ways, but it's not without its critics. The convention has been questioned for its Western bias, and people have pointed to the difference between the rhetoric of children's rights and the reality of children's lives. Or to put that in a more positive way, how far have we come in relation to children's rights, and how far do we need to still go? And I think these debates, amongst others, will animate some of the presentations and the dialogue that we'll have tonight. As we take up questions about an area that's been largely unexamined, which is what's the relevance of children's rights in a higher education context? So we often, sometimes in higher education, we study children's rights in other sectors. So in the school system and healthcare systems, but what about within higher education contexts themselves? So we hope that the discussion tonight will give us a chance, both between the speakers and all of you who are here, to have some discussion about the place of a children's rights perspective in developing professional and academic practices, how a children's rights perspective might challenge assumptions that we have as students, as lecturers, and as researchers and community members, and whether higher education actually should be taking more steps to take children's perspectives into account in the research and teaching that we're doing. So to get us started thinking about these questions, we're very lucky to have an excellent panel tonight. I'm really excited myself to hear the speakers. So we'll start with the panelists, and then we'll open the floor for discussion and dialogue. And at the end of the session, please do stay for drinks and snacks and a chance to chat. I should just point out a few other logistical points. We are recording the session tonight so that it can be available to people who were not able to attend. So just be aware of that. There are books that are for looking and for sale if you're interested, some that come from the speakers tonight. And they'll be available till after the session. Okay, so without further ado, let me move on to the people that you've come here to see, not me, but the speakers themselves. And I'm really pleased to introduce our first speaker this evening, who's come down from Sheffield University, Dr. Afua, Twum, Danso, Imoh. Okay, I didn't do that very well, I'm very sorry. She's a lecturer in the Sociology of Childhood at the University of Sheffield and a co-editor of the recent book, Children's Lives in an Era of Children's Rights, The Progress of the Convention of the Rights of the Child in Africa. She will be speaking about the relevance, challenges, and future directions of children's rights in a higher education.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Rachel, and thank you very much for inviting me. I like to have any excuse to come down to London every once in a while. Okay, right, so it's going to be a bit awkward because I have to turn around and switch the slides. So, as Rachel said in her introduction, the Convention on the Rights of the Child was a culmination of pretty much over 100 years of discourse on children's rights. And as such, it was seen as marking a turning point in how children were viewed and should be dealt with, at least in terms of international policy making. And it provided a vision, and for many it excited many people, or as Michael Freeman said, it excited the world. But however, turning this landmark treaty in international law into a reality which has an impact on children's lives has been a journey full of pitfalls and obstacles. So 25 years after its adoption by the United Nations General Assembly, no country, either in the south or in the north, has been able to fully realise the provisions of the convention. And these challenges facing the convention relate to factors both inherent to the convention and the drafting process, and factors that are external to the convention. And these challenges have been the focus of much sociological analysis in the past 25 years. Numerous studies in particular have been produced which critique the convention or which seek to analyse its impact in various countries. And the new Sociology of Childhood, which became popularised around the same time as the convention was adopted, has offered researchers and students a useful framework to analyse the implementation of the convention and its limitations in particular. Specifically, the concept of childhood as a social construction, which is a key component of the sociology of childhood, has frequently been used by many, including myself, I should say, to show how the vision of childhood articulated by the convention is intrinsically linked to developments in Western Europe and North America, and is therefore inapplicable to non-Western societies who, it is argued, construct childhood in very different ways. And certainly these analyses that have been offered are indeed valid, because the convention in its implementation phase has faced numerous obstacles in different contexts, and while resource scarcity and lack of political will are certainly key obstacles facing the convention, we've also noticed that culture and tradition are also key factors in understanding the limited implementation of the convention. And this again is something that has emerged in numerous studies. My own research studies in recent years have shown in different ways how culture has had an impact on the implementation of the convention. And the first thing I want to look at is the whole language of rights and how it's understood or reacted to by local communities in the countries that I focus on, and these countries are specifically Ghana and Nigeria. So firstly, the language of rights, at least as it's articulated in the convention, has proved problematic within many of the communities that I work in. In large parts of Africa, or maybe I should say West Africa, many believe that children's rights, in cases where they are aware of such a concept, means children's rights to empowerment only. Therefore, they reject the concept, and sometimes they do so quite angrily because they feel it attacks the very premise on which their cultural values are based. In my own research in Ghana, the idea of children having rights simply because they're children was something that was met with rejection during the fieldwork phase of my PhD research, which is about almost 10 years ago now. And as a result, when explaining the obstacles facing the concept of children's rights in the Ghanaian context, several adults who participated in focus group discussions explained that we do not want Western children here in Ghana. And the implication behind this statement is that they believe in Western countries, rightly or wrongly, they believe that children expect their entitlements but do not give anything in return. And what is evident here is the belief that rights, or better still entitlements, have to come along with duties. And according to a journalist who participated in one of my focus groups, the relationship between parents and children is a process of negotiation. A child does his duties and a parent fulfills the rights of this child. And similar sentiments were expressed by others actually in the same focus group discussion. So reciprocity, which is in fact the tie that binds other values such as responsibility and respect, is very much a key factor in the Ghanaian context. Now, this sphere of rights, at least how they're articulated within the convention and what they mean for communities, have emerged as a problem in other African contexts as well. And the other example I want to share with you is that of a more recent study I undertook in Nigeria a couple of years ago with a UK-based NGO called Stepping Stones Nigeria, based in Manchester. And this study focused on children's participation in the Niger Delta of Nigeria. And we had a series of focus group discussions with NGO workers, and there were also interviews and workshops with children. And one of the local NGO participants in a focus group discussion highlighted the extent to which using the convention alone in the work of that particular NGO had caused some problems. And as a result, they started to think about what else they could do. They started to rethink their strategy for working with children in schools. And you can see the difficulties they faced and how they addressed it within in that quote here. I'm not going to read it. I'll just give you some time. Actually, I won't give you some time. I don't have time. So I thought I was in a lecture for a moment. Sorry. So a similar example is provided by Amy Norman in the book that Rachel talked about. She had a chapter in that book focusing on South Africa. And in that chapter, she argues that the challenges presented by the rights discourse in South Africa led to the development of what they call a Bill of Responsibilities, which was introduced in 2010. And now, today in South Africa, apparently, this Bill of Responsibilities is taught alongside the convention in schools. And the reason why this is done is to emphasize that children's rights are inseparable from their duties and their responsibilities. And this, they felt, needed to be highlighted to children. Now, the other thing I want to talk about is the whole idea of children's participation, which is one of the key principles of the convention and is also articulated in a number of the rights in the body of the convention. And despite the focus of the convention on what are called participatory rights, we have to acknowledge that these articles have proved to be arguably the most controversial of all the articles in the convention. And the way childhood is defined or the way childhood is constructed is critical to community attitudes to children's participation. And again, in my research in Ghana, again for my PhD, I identified a number of components of the social construction of childhood and the child rearing process, which had an impact on children's ability to exercise their so-called participatory rights. And one of the main factors that emerged in discussions with children and adults was dependency, or the role of dependency, which was seen as the crucial factor for constructing childhood. So many participants defined the child as somebody who cannot look after himself because he does not work, who cannot pay school fees, and has no money to look after himself, which means that his parents take care of him and do everything for him. And as several participants, both children and adults, pointed out at different times in the research process, a child is fed by an adult. A child does not feed an adult. And this point was further elaborated in a focus group discussion with elders at the Chief's Palace in one of the communities I was working in. And you can see the sentiments expressed in the bottom quote on the slide. So, as a dependent who is fed, a child is supposed to rely on his parents for all her needs, and to ensure that these needs are met, to ensure that these needs are met, she has to submit to the control and authority of her parents. So, these two examples that I've just shared with you have hopefully shown how culture and its constructions of childhood and even its understandings of rights have had an impact on the convention, at least within the Ghanaian and Nigerian context in the last 25 years. However, despite these challenges, we must also acknowledge the achievements the convention has made since its adoption. And these are certainly significant. And as Deirdre Fottrell has argued, the convention has elevated the child to the status of an independent rights holder. And again, Lisa Vol has expressed similar sentiments in the quote on this side of the slide. So certainly we can see that in terms of impact, the convention has increased the visibility of children as rights holders. In fact, you could argue that it has put the very idea of children as rights holders squarely on the table for discussion. And today, at least within the African context, in workshops and seminars that are held across the continent, NGOs and policymakers are talking about the convention, or they're using the convention as a tool to train, educate, or sensitize professionals or community leaders. Again, today in many countries across the continent, we have feature articles and television and radio programs aiming to sensitize children or adults within communities on the very concept of children's rights, and also on the convention in particular. And this is very interesting, considering that the continent of Africa has its own children's rights charter, the African Charter on the rights and welfare of the child. But actually we find that there tends to be more focus on the convention than the charter. In addition to this, we have numerous local NGOs that have been established in the wake of the adoption of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, who have come to embrace the concept of children's rights for various reasons. A lot of these NGOs are funded by international agencies such as UNICEF, and there's a possibility that a lot of this embracing of children's rights could be down to the fact that there is funding available for it. But I think there's also a need to acknowledge that for some people it is down to a genuine commitment to ensure that these rights articulated in this Western-based or Western-biased convention can be enjoyed by even poor children in communities in their context. And in some instances, the convention has led to the concept of children's rights becoming embedded in the language of local communities, whether they're talking about it positively or negatively. We can see that in some places it's at least been talked about. Therefore, today, in countries across Africa, those people who are aware of the concept of children's rights, and I have to say there are still many who are not, but those who are aware of the concept of children's rights know about it in connection with the convention. And this is something that can certainly be seen as an achievement. Oh, sorry, I missed the slide. So the concept of rights or children's rights and its articulation in the convention has also filtered through into academia, and we have seen a proliferation of courses at both undergraduate and postgraduate levels which analyse children's rights, and certainly we have noticed, at least at Sheffield, an increase in the number of PhD applications wanting to look at some aspects of children's rights. And this interest in children's rights is not only from an international law perspective, but we're also seeing a lot of people doing research and teaching on this topic from disciplines such as sociology, social policy, anthropology, politics, etc., etc. And these are having an enormous impact on the students who are taking these courses, either as undergraduates or master's students. In addition, and as I said earlier, academic research has also become preoccupied with the convention and children's rights. Again, the interest and the research that has been done on this has been done from different disciplines, and this has enabled us to provide a holistic picture of children's rights and its realization in different countries. And while much of the sociological literature emerging from countries in the north, which focuses on the convention, seeks to critique the convention and highlight its Western bias, it's interesting to note that many Southern academics who also write about the convention seem to very often want to explore ways that this treaty can be made applicable to children in their context. And there are two examples I want to share with you to highlight this point. And the first one is that of an African-based academic who wanted to show in her research and her article the detrimental effects of child domestic work for children. She wasn't interested in the idea of agency and the role it plays in child domestic workers' decisions to take on various work. For her, it was quite clear that these were children who were being exploited, and in fact, she seemed very tired of discourses that seemed to want to highlight their agency or the social construction of childhood and its implications for children's roles in society. The second example is that of a PhD student or a prospective PhD student who's also based on the continent but has had part of his education overseas. And for him, he sees child labour as a gross violation of the rights of children. And he's not just talking about the worst forms of child labour. While he agrees that children may need to do chores in the house and that they should do, but beyond that, he feels that children should not be engaging in other forms of work. And therefore, he wants to, through his PhD, engage the discussion or contribute to making his country a child labour-free zone, as he puts it, and ensure that children are kept in classrooms and off the market, again, as he put it. Now, these examples relate to academics or students who are based on the continent, but both of those two examples have had part of their education, their postgraduate education, overseas. And they adopt these positions certainly not because they're not aware of the Western bias of the convention or the real complex challenges facing children and adults in communities which they're part of. So in fact, we see that they are very much aware of it, but yet they seem to want to embrace the provisions stipulated by the convention, and they want these to apply to children in their context. Therefore, despite the realities of children's lives in their context, they insist that children should be in school and not engage in work, be it domestic work or other forms of work. Therefore, there's a need to understand the perspectives they adopt, and certainly UNICEF, which funds a lot of the work that academics do in the countries that I'm familiar with, could have a role to play in this. You know, a lot of academics rely on UNICEF to give them consultancies, et cetera, and that could have a role to play in the positions that academics adopt. However, I think there's a need to go beyond this and really understand the reason for this. So, in terms of future directions, I would say that certainly the Convention has increased the visibility of children's rights, but where do we go next? What are the next steps? And from a sociological perspective, and also from the point of view of practice, I believe that we need to continue critiquing the Convention in light of the challenges it still faces as a result of lack of political will, lack of resources, and culture and tradition. However, beyond critiquing and highlighting the challenges the Convention faces, we also need to start thinking about the opportunities that exist which could contribute to the better realization of children's lives. And an encouraging factor is that the reality of people's lives illustrates that there is indeed a middle ground, a grey area in which people live their lives, which is influenced by both tradition and culture, and something which is akin to social change. And this is especially the case in Africa, where colonialism has led to European and traditional values existing side by side, supplemented by Islam in what the late Ali Mazrui has termed Africa's triple heritage. And what this middle ground means in real terms is that we're starting to see significant numbers of people in societies on the continent and elsewhere whose outlook incorporates both local and global values, especially with regards to child rearing, often picking and choosing which cultural heritage to adopt and which to flout at any one time. And this is something that Rhoda Howard puts very well in the quote at the bottom of the slide. So social change, social change, both at the local and the global level, is a critical factor in our understanding of a middle ground in children's lives. And in particular, we have to acknowledge that many countries in the South have been undergoing tremendous social and economic changes in recent decades as a result of urbanization, economic growth, rising education levels, globalization, etc., etc. And these changes have had an impact on all aspects of social life in these countries, including those that relate to constructions of childhood, child rearing, parent-child relationships. Therefore, while culture continues to be important in the lives of children, it's also possible to recognize that culture is not a static entity that's descended from our ancestors. In fact, it is man-made, and as something that is man-made, it is subject to change. So I have a bit more, I was going to talk a bit more, but I've run out of time, so I think this is a good place to end it. Thank you very much.
Students within the higher education system, either doing master's or doctorate level work, and they'll be talking about the impact that studying children's rights in a university context has had on their own study and professional practice and personal development. Our first speaker in this group is Caroline Lynch. She completed the MA in Sociology of Childhood and Children's Rights in 2011 at the Institute of Education. And she carried on, and she's now doing doctoral work on children's rights issues which emerge from homeless children's experiences of compulsory education in England. She's also a practicing barrister and working in the area of child protection for the last 11 years. Caroline, thank you.
Thank you. It's really, really nice to be able to make a contribution, a small contribution to today's event, and it's great, I think, that the topic that's been selected for discussion is one that's accessible to those of us who are more in the infancy of our relationship with children's rights and the Convention, and indeed our academic journey. What I want to talk about in my slot is my journey and relationship with children's rights, and the opportunity that learning about childhood and children's rights has afforded to me, and how it's continued to be really important to me personally and in my day-to-day practice as a lawyer. I'm going to start then to that end with what began for me as a bit of a mystery when I was 6 years into my practice. I was working representing some children, but often local authorities, often parents, in courts in the north of England. About 6 years in, I was very much troubled by several things, but particularly troubled by what felt to me like an absence from children from the cases I was dealing with. I was pretty sure I was dealing with cases about children. I was talking about children who were in care, children who it was thought should be in care, the care system that is, children who were placed with family members, not always their own parents, children separated from their siblings, children who were to be adopted, and some children who were placed in secure settings away from their families. The cases were different. The triggers for state intervention were different, though themes re-emerged, and certainly the precipitating events that triggered the involvement of the court were different. But these were definitely cases about children, about their relationships, about their families, about their lives and their futures. So with that all in mind, what do I mean when I say I felt that there was an absence of children in this work that I was doing? It wasn't so much that I didn't see children. I was never given an expectation that I, as a lawyer in court, would be seeing children, though at times that was something I came to question. What was troubling me was that I wasn't hearing children, and I wasn't hearing very much about the people who were telling me that they were hearing children. I wasn't sure I even knew what it meant for children to be heard in this setting. I was being asked to take an awful lot at face value about what it meant to work with children in the right way. I wasn't even sure what the right way, in fact, was meant to be. I was certainly being asked to place near absolute confidence in other people's professional judgments. I was being asked to place absolute confidence in a phrase, the ascertainable wishes and feelings of the child, which comes from our Children Act. I wasn't sure, actually, on closer scrutiny, that I understood really what that meant. I didn't know how that phrase had been arrived at, and if it was right, no one had ever justified that to me. And most importantly, I didn't know what the forum was in which for me to have those discussions and debates. It certainly wasn't in the court forum. The mystery deepened for me somewhat around this time when I realised that what I was thinking about, what I was starting to discuss, were actually gaps in the system in which I was working and gaps in the law which I was supposed to be applying and analysing. Those gaps meant that I made comments, the response to which from my peers and colleagues were things like, well, don't say that in front of Caroline, she's going to get terribly upset. That they were talking about were the comments that were being made that we don't really want to go into that, do we, when talking about exactly how a child had been involved in a meeting about their life. That was often that people didn't want to talk about what I was being told was obviously an unpalatable suggestion that children should be more present in the courts in which I worked. And I was also pretty sure that was also me being asked to accept that certain kinds of plans for children's lives came with certain accompanying inevitabilities about who in their family they would have ongoing relationships with. So those were the gaps, and that was becoming the daily lived mystery for me in my working life. And where that mystery took me after several hours of internet-based research and some misty-eyed thoughts about returning to study was to an MA programme here, looking at the sociology of childhood and children's rights. Now, I've said all of that not with some burning desire to share with you my life history and my working history, but so that I can go on with this topic for this discussion in mind to talk about what, for want of a better word, I'll call my enlightenment. So point one of my enlightenment was that I came to studying children's rights feeling very keenly that I could not do my job properly. I came feeling that unless I understood something better about childhood and childhoods, unless I understood something more about children's rights and this convention, that the gaps that I identified were not going to be filled for me, and that was going to directly affect how I did my job. The second enlightenment point for me was that the very process of studying children's rights and now progressing to doctoral study in relation to and research in relation to children's rights raised for me really important questions about attitudes to professional development. not just professional development in the sense of meeting that threshold of hours that often your professional body or regulator says you need to cover in each given year, and not professional development in the sense of being able to say to a colleague, oh, I went on a really interesting course yesterday, but the kind of professional development that is about reflecting not just upon what you do, but why you do it. Professional development that is really about understanding why you challenge the things you challenge and why you accept the things that you just go on to accept. I've spoken in my own fledgling research, PhD research, about using children's rights and the Convention as an analytical tool, as well as remembering it's a legal instrument. Given that I'm a lawyer, that's important to me. But as an analytical tool, it means that I now use the Convention to analyse the advice I give, to analyse the sufficiency of some of the interventions that I'm told about in my daily practice. It's a lens. Children's rights is a lens which hugely influences the advice I give, the questions I frame to colleagues, to professionals, and the questions I ask in court and how I ask them. When I ask a question, as I always have, about a child's looked after review, I've always, as a lawyer, asked when, where, who's included and why. The children's rights framework for me has meant that I ask many more detailed questions about the child's involvement in that process, not just whether the child was present or why the child was present, but how many times that issue was raised with that child, the way in which it was raised, why it's been or if it's going to be revisited. When my colleagues make comments still about the things I say and the way I do things, I'm better able to deal with those comments and those challenges because I can justify my approach, because I understand that the approach I'm taking is actually a children's rights approach. There is a reason for it, and there is a good reason for it. So my conclusions and lessons learned from these experiences are these. Discussions and efforts which limit children's rights and the Convention as being important just to those who work directly with children is, for me, really quite flawed. I rarely come into contact with children, but as I've said, it's become central to me to have an understanding about children's rights and deem it important in what I do for me to do a good job. Children's rights isn't any one thing. It isn't always an obvious children's issue. Everything, in my view, has a children's right angle. And lastly, the research that goes on about children's lives is really important. It's research which underpins or should underpin some professional norms and practices which exist in this country. And if the good research isn't there, those norms and practices are not justified, in my view. The place of research in court cases and court hearings is something which ebbs and flows in popularity and significance, but it's something that I keep a much keener eye on in my practice now as a result of studying children's rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Our next speaker is Laura Quick. She did the Children's Rights in Practice module. It's part of our MA here this past spring. She has worked as a teacher and with families whose children have been excluded from mainstream education. So really pleased to invite Laura up.
Rachel's asked me to speak briefly about how studying children's rights has impacted my thinking about working with children. And as a teacher, I was particularly interested in how, in the place of rights in schools, and particularly in Article 12, children's right to participate. I was interested in democratic education before I started the module, which is partly why I chose it. And for me, the course was really good at pulling together and clarifying things that I was half feeling already, and also at raising quite big questions and complexities about how I'd been thinking about democratic education before. As a teacher who cares about children's participation, it's very easy to feel quite isolated and out on a limb in a school. And I think perhaps one of the most fundamental things that this course gave me was I was suddenly introduced to a whole body of conversation and literature about the exact thing that I'd been thinking about quite on my own for a long time before. Although I'd always had a belief that children needed more decision-making power in school, I'd kind of justified it, like in the class, in the staff room or whatever, before the module, more on empirical grounds, kind of arguing that children learnt more, or they were happier, or they were more engaged when they participated more in their school day. And I think one of the things this course has given me, which I've really enjoyed, is I've been able to put forward kind of more ethical and political arguments alongside the more practical ones. If you mention kind of Article 12 in schools, people think you're talking about school councils. But I got on the course really interested in the kind of minute by minute, everyday participation and control. That's part of all of our relationships in schools, and really impacts all the children's days, I think. We're told that as teachers we make 1,500 educational decisions every day, which I can well believe. In one of the schools that I worked in, I was expected to plan children's days almost down to the minute. And I used to give kind of strings of time-related instructions. So it would be 2 minutes to talk to your talk partners, 3 minutes to write your adjectives on your whiteboard, 10 minutes to write your introduction. And I remember in an observation being told to accompany these instructions with a big clock on the interactive whiteboard behind me. And as well as these educational decisions, any of us who've been teachers know that we control all sorts of other aspects of a child's day, when they talk to their friends, how loudly they talk to their friends, when they can go to the toilet, how fast they walk down the corridor, when they can have a drink. So in contrast to this kind of micromanagement, I'd also had the rare opportunity of teaching for 6 months at the Albany Free School, which is a democratic school in New York State. It's a little bit like Summerhill that some of you might have heard of, but it's for 3 to 14-year-olds, and it's a day school. And unlike Summerhill, it's much more kind of socially and racially mixed. So Albany probably it was really interesting because Albany probably has gives children or allows children the kind of the most everyday control that I can imagine within an educational context, using the model of a school. Children, apart from being at school between 8:30 and 3, which is a legal requirement, children can basically do what they want within that time. They can play all day if they want to, and a lot of them do. They play outside. There's a ping pong table. They got really into wrestling when I was there. Or they might kind of set up kind of longer term games. For instance, a group of children in the class that I was attached to created a post office for a few weeks while I was there, and they stamped and delivered everybody's letters for them. There are more conventional lessons, and a lot of children go to quite a lot of conventional lessons. Though interestingly, children who've joined the school recently tend to play quite continuously for a long time before they go to lessons, especially if they've joined a bit later from the public school system. And conversely, those children who are getting near to 14 and know they're about to move on to a new school tend to go to more and more conventional lessons to kind of, they want to get themselves ready. The whole school community, so children and adults together, they make and reinforce the rules. There's kind of one main rule, which is the most fiercely enforced rule, which is the stop rule. If anyone asks anyone to stop anything, you have to do it. You're free to argue about it afterwards, but you have to stop. And I found this rule really interesting because it was so simple, but it encompassed pages of a kind of traditional behaviour policy in past schools that I'd worked in. To be honest, coming straight from the UK state school where I'd been teaching, it took me a little bit of time to adjust going to Albany. I think I realised to my shame that I'd previously been quite reliant on children's grateful appreciation of me treating them with more respect than a lot of my colleagues did. And suddenly in Albany, that respect wasn't a gift, it was just taken for granted. And they weren't interested in pleasing me just because I was a teacher, and I had to earn their respect in the same way as I have to earn respect from adults in my life. For instance, I remember my first few lessons that I offered, no one came, and I was totally devastated about this. And it really, suddenly when kids don't have to come to your lessons, it really changes the way you think about them. And it wasn't just me, I don't think, that found relinquishing kind of adult roles challenging. A lot of the other teachers, not a lot, some of the other teachers spoke quite a lot in our school council meetings, often saying things that had already been said by a child, almost as though even in the Albany context, their voice was more valuable than the 6-year-old who just said the exact same thing. So I'd had this experience. However, so the one thing I did really take away from Albany, which I found really useful, was a kind of rough rule of thumb that all the teachers seemed to live by, which was that if you were treating a child in a way that you wouldn't treat an adult, just to check in with yourself and other people that it really was necessary. And sometimes it was, but that was something I really try and live my life by now when I'm working. Or anyway, actually. So I'd had that experience, and I think my experience at Albany was really helpful doing the Children's Rights in Practice module. I found that really valuable. But, as always, the more you know about something, the more complicated it becomes. And studying children's rights definitely threw up some kind of difficult questions for me. For example, in my second year of teaching over here, I was able to give my Year 6 class quite a lot of freedom by state school standards. I had a bunch of mainly girls who really took up this opportunity. And I felt really proud of the way that I saw their competence growing over the 3 terms that I had them. We were putting on a play, and they were constantly kind of booking massive ladders with the caretaker and rooms, and working with other children to check the props were sorted and everyone knew their lines. And the more freedom I gave them, the more confident they became, and so the more freedom everybody gave them, and it was a real kind of cyclical thing. And at the time I really loved this newfound independence, but looking back now, having done the course, I realised that actually I think I was offering opportunities that those children with middle class capital were far more able to take up. And then on top of this, I was further rewarding them by giving them even more freedom and opportunities when they did take them up. I've also been reading Diane Ray recently about the kind of destructive effects of pupil hierarchies, and I fear I may also, just to take that example, I may also have been reinforcing existing pupil hierarchies in the class, as well as learning a lot of really useful things. I suspect those girls also learnt that they were more competent and in some ways better than other children in the class. And I fear that other children in the class might have learnt that these girls were better than them too. So if I go back to teaching now, I think I'll need to think really differently about how I introduce participation in the classroom. Clearly I wouldn't want to deny children that kind of opportunity that those girls had, but I would need to find a way of doing it in a way that all the children benefited. I also felt uncomfortable that some of the public discussion around rights focused a lot on the individual and about kind of working out what you want and then pursuing it, which is potentially quite a kind of entrepreneurial and neoliberal view of people. So my next course, my next task, kind of where the course left me, is to think about how I can introduce participation into the classroom, which I still remain completely committed to, but do it in a way that emphasises kind of collectivity and interconnectedness over or as well as the individual. And like anything new that we introduce into our classrooms, really need to make sure that it decreases rather than reinforces inequalities.
Our next speaker then is May Abu Mogli. She's a Palestinian human rights activist based in London and a PhD candidate here at the Institute of Education. Her research focuses on human rights education in Palestinian authorities in the occupied West Bank. She holds a master's degree in human rights from the University of Essex and has worked extensively in human rights in the MENA region. So welcome, May.
I'll just pull up your slides here. I was told to talk for 10 minutes, so okay. So I'm going to be brief. Hi, everyone. Wow, that's a lot of people. Okay, thanks for being here. I'm really happy to be here talking about such a milestone in the field of not only child's rights, but human rights. As a human rights activist, for me, I get really excited when something about human rights is discussed, particularly here at the Institute of Education, to see how human rights are actually mainstreamed in the field of education, which is very important to happen. And talking about child's rights is pretty key for our work as teachers or human rights defenders working in human rights, and lawyers and barristers and social workers. Today I'll be talking about 3 aspects that I realized linked together during my field research, which are critical ethnography, ethics, and the Convention of the Right of the Child, which I never linked, they never linked for me in my head prior to my field research. As Rachel mentioned, my research is a human rights education in Palestinian Authority schools, which are government schools in the occupied West Bank. So I worked with children who live and are exposed to extreme levels of violence on multiple levels. These children I worked with face violence within the school, where there's corporal punishment, for example. There's high levels of domestic violence in households. Also, they face primarily extensive violence from the Israeli colonial occupation army and illegal Jewish settlers who control the areas where they live and go to school. So it was really, how do I do this? It was really important for me to think about issues of ethics, of how to deal and work with these students in such a complex situation. Now, PhD students who are at the IoE, and I'm sure in other universities, we have to do something called the risk assessment and ethics assessment form. So there are a set of procedures and a form that you have to fill. How are you going to work with your research participants? And you have to go through this form, and this form goes to a committee, and the committee approves the form, and then you go to your field research. So for me, in my head, it was a procedure. How to mitigate the risk and, think about all these kind of things from a theoretical perspective. So what I had to do is, which I'm sure many PhD students have to do the risk assessment, write informed consents to use when you go and work with your participants. They have to read through them and sign them. And for me, I did not even question that. You have to do a police report. For example, when I was in the field, the Palestinian Ministry of Education asked me to go to the police station and get a form confirming that I was not convicted before I go to schools and work with these children. I got a formal approval from the local authority, which is the Ministry of Education, which I had to show to the IoE so that the risk assessment was approved. And I had to adhere to certain ethics guidelines, which at the Institute of Education are the BERA ethics guidelines, which is the British Education Research Association. So you go through all these procedures and you don't think, how is that reflected during your field research and how does that link to the UNCRC? Once I was in the field, I'm going to give 2 examples how these 3 aspects link together. The BERA guidelines. I was really surprised when I read through the 11 pages of the BERA guidelines that a number of UNCRC articles were actually mentioned in the guidelines. For example, Article 3, which talks about the best interests of the child. What does that mean? Especially when I worked in the context of extreme violence, where these children have they have lots of implications, psychological implications, physical implications. What does the best interest of a child mean? Am I imposing something on them? Am I forcing them to give me information that they don't want to? There is this kind of a power relationship between me as a researcher, as an outsider, although I'm an insider as a Palestinian, but I come from a Western institution, so I'm an outsider, and it creates some kind of a strange power relation. So thinking about this was very interesting for me, and it was of course reflected in my methodology chapter, my ethics chapter. Article 12, which talks about participation, and was mentioned before, and particularly the informed consent, which must be voluntary. In a Palestinian school context is very, very, very hierarchical, and children have no space to actively participate. Everything is told to them. They do what they're told. There's corporal punishment if they don't adhere to what the head teacher or the teacher says. The informed consent for me was very tricky because I thought I'm an outsider, I'm a researcher, I'm an adult. I'm going to be even forcing more things on these poor children, and they're going to have no chance to say no to that. However, when I gave the informed consent to the teachers, head teachers, and the children at the same time, children were very happy that they had to do something equally as their teachers and head teachers. And that empowered them to actually come to me and say, you know what, we don't want to participate. And I don't think if they were not given that chance to see a form at the same time as their teachers, do the exact same thing as their teacher and head teachers, they would have had the chance or empowered enough to come to me and say, you know what, we don't want to participate. And for me, that was a very positive aspect, thinking about ethics and the UNCRC. So we talked about participation, the power relation between the researcher and the child, and how these procedures, when we think and engage critically with them, actually we can make a change, even if it was for a split second. So we talk about and there's also Article 13, which is the freedom of expression. Article 16, which is also mentioned in BERA, was about the right to privacy, and this is when we think about anonymity, particularly when you work in very small communities where it's very, very difficult to be anonymous. So what does that mean when you work with these children who might actually give you information that might risk their lives? But I worked with children who were, for example, detained by Israeli army, and they had to go through confession processes and everything. So what does that mean when they give me that kind of information? Where does the privacy stop? How are they anonymous? Particularly in such a small community, in villages where everyone knows that you as an outsider did actually interview these children. How are the ethical lines drawn, and what does that mean in terms of implementation of the CRC? So out of this experience, I realized that the UNCRC gives the researchers, academics, and practitioners a framework, a lens, again, that you've mentioned, through which we can make positive change in the context itself by actually giving the chance to these children to express if they wanted to participate or not. That was a little bit of a change from what they're used to in the lives of our research participants. So maybe this chance or their ability to say no or yes or decide for themselves would be reflected on other decisions that they might make in the future. And for critically engaging with ethnographic research and looking at it from a different perspective, mainstreaming the UNCRC in our ethnographic research and field work. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, May. And I'm so pleased to introduce our final speaker of the evening. She hardly needs introduction. Priscilla Alderson is a professor emerita at the Institute of Education. She's a founder of the Childhood Studies, or the MA in Sociology of Childhood and Children's Rights degree here at the Institute. Her work has been widely published on children's competence, wisdom, and children's rights. She's doctoral supervisor for many students who work with children through a children's rights lens, and we're really pleased to have her, that she's able to speak tonight on the relevance, challenges, and future directions of children's rights in a higher education context. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for arranging this really interesting evening, Rachel, and it was such a thrill to listen to the students from our MA and feel that there's such a huge variety and expertise and people coming from all over the world, and every year the course is just so brilliant and we learn such a lot. Is it 10 or 12 years old or something like that, the MA?
2003, so...
11. Right.
Almost there.
Yes. Well, as the 25th anniversary of the convention, this evening at the House of Commons, some of you may well know there's a book launch of the 12th State of Children's Rights in England report, which the Children's Rights Alliance for England compile every year And this year it's quite a sad report about the austerity and how it's particularly hitting children. Really important to look at on the website. Also at the back there are 3 notices, because this morning they have advertised for a job for being a participation officer to organise children and young people to compile the government's the NGO's next report to the Committee on the Rights of the Child and to inform the government. So if you're interested, please have a look at the poster. Also, CRE, last time they reported to Geneva for England, for the UK rather, the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child was so impressed that they'd involved children and young people so fully in the whole process of collecting and reporting information that they advised other countries around the world to do that too. Now, I was going to look very briefly at some of the higher education specialties and how we could spread children's rights more around them. And I'll start with sociology, of course, and a 60-year-old book, The Sociological Imagination, that starts by saying we should connect private troubles, individual lives, to public issues. And that's exactly what human rights do. In fact, if you took one child with Ebola today and traced their rights, their life, their economic circumstances, you would see a picture of the whole of global healthcare, wouldn't it? And partly how Western countries steal trained practitioners from the majority world. And that child was so graphically illustrated. And a lot of our children's rights work is to see the world in a grain of sand almost. Now, with childhood studies, I quite like to begin the course by saying what exactly is the difference between a child and an adult, apart from all the ascribed cultural, legal and so on differences. What exactly are the physical and mental differences between, say, lots of older children and lots of adults? I'm not able to think of one, and I'd be interested if someone would come up with one later. So it's partly looking beyond the prejudices and stereotypes of ideas of childhood and thinking about children as real people and how they're multiply disadvantaged by age, intersecting with gender, ethnicity, class, ability. In the conventions, the rights conventions, there are long lists of differences, and the one that's missing of all the discriminations, does anyone know what it is? The great discrimination. Sexual orientation we've got, religion, birth. It's age. It's missing in all of them. Even the children's one. So also, childhood studies by its international research has been looking at different kinds of childhoods, as we've heard from Afua, but also from war, looking from the viewpoints of child soldiers and child refugees. From work, looking at the viewpoint of child workers and the great debates about whether children should work or not, and when. And the UN Convention, by the way, does not veto child work. Also looking at the injustice of trade and how child workers are so exploited by that. Now, beyond all the sociology and the collecting of data and so on, I think the next really important discipline is history. And if we look at the history of rights, of human rights, not just children's rights, we can see that really there have been millennia of struggle for freedom from tyranny and slavery. And next year, Magna Carta will be 800 years old. It's against arbitrary imprisonment, rape and murder. And if people say, oh, we can't have children's rights, does that mean no rights at all? It's okay to kill children. Now, when you start looking at that viewpoint, people say, oh, well, yes, you've got to have some rights, the big rights to against slavery, false imprisonment and so on, but how far in do you take those rights? And that's the big debate, rather than whether they've got rights or not. I'm not sure that rights are a Western idea, and you all know how anti-human rights. A great deal of the tabloid newspapers are, for instance, and a lot of the other mass media. And UKIP's ascendancy is partly they're going to get rid of the Human Rights Act, aren't they? And the government's hoping to do that too. So if adult rights are so unpopular and disputed, children's rights are even less popular to lots of people in Britain. Now, around the late 1940s, there was an explosion of interest in human rights after the Nazi trials, and the anxiety of everyone, just how can we stop cruel, degrading and inhuman treatment, torture, treating people as non-humans. And I think everyone studying children's rights ought to look at the 1948 UN Declaration on Human Rights, because that's where the Convention on the Rights of the Child grew out of. It repeats so many of those phrases. Children's rights weren't sort of dreamt up in 89. They follow a great long tradition of human rights. Of course, after the Convention and the European Convention as well, the Declaration and the 1950 European Convention, on which our Human Rights Act is based, struggles continued, and children highlighted things like the children of Soweto in 1976 and lots of other examples of knowing their civil and political rights and searching for equity and justice, respect and freedom from want. Now, I think there's a lot of infantilising of children's rights. For instance, right to play. Oh, children need that for their developmental needs. Well, actually, the right to play, again, comes out of hundreds of years of struggle by adults to have time off work for rest, leisure and recreation, paid holidays. And that is the echo in the right to play. And adults play all the time too, don't they? Imagination, music, sport. It's not something just children do. Let's connect adults and children. Article 12 does not mention decisions or participation. And when participation is mentioned only 3 times in the Convention, it's always as a practical activity, not as a talking shop idea. Article 12 comes out of the clauses on everyone's freedom of expression and a fair hearing in court of law, as Caroline has been talking about. That's the grounds of Article 12, really. And the second part of Article 12 talks about judicial or administrative proceedings, but it means sort of stretched into all sorts of other things. Meanwhile, lots of people talk about the Convention if it's only Article 12, and they take no notice of things like rights to freedom of expression, of association, of peaceful assembly. You know, you can join peaceful protests. It's your right, whatever your age. And lots of protests do have children in pushchairs and of all age groups there and children make posters and so on. Children's active involvement in society is through all the articles, and especially 12 to 17 on these freedoms. People say we haven't got enough on child-led households and street children and so on. Huge problem. If you start saying, oh, they're a separate group, do all the other rights apply to them? Do they have extra rights that other children don't have? I think people who say this should read through the Convention carefully from the viewpoint of a street child and think, what rights would I add? That's the way to do it, rather than saying, oh, they're missing. Disabled children, it said, are missing from the Convention. They've got their own article, and every other article applies to them too. Right, now that was a bit on history. The next, philosophy. Oh, right. Philosophy was, philosophers really refined what ordinary working people had struggled for and protested about. And I was going to say how philosophy is usually very elitist, but could be reinterpreted in a much more inclusive way. Then I was going to talk about law, and next door, Michael Freeman at University College that we're going to join. I expect you all know he's been editing the International Journal of Children's Rights, and that's the 22nd year of that. And just down the road at LSE, that's quite a hotbed of rights, isn't it? But they haven't really woken up to children's rights. But I hope, also, as a sideline to that, generated by higher education, I hope a lot of you reading Shami Chakrabarty's brilliant book about how she has battles with the government over rights, and it's always holding them up for inspection. They don't welcome that. But again, we should be seeing children's rights in that kind of context. Now, I was going to talk about psychology, psychoanalysis, economics, education, all the sciences, biology, medicine and nursing, because all rights are about bodies, actually. Again, read through the convention and think, how do people need bodies to be rights holders? And what does medicine and nursing tell us about it? Engineering and invention, and how, for instance, mobile phones are transforming the lives of adults and children around Africa from the point of view of education, running micro businesses and all sorts of things like that. Again, there are so many areas in the universities where it would be good if children's rights people went and talked to all these people and woke them up even more to the brilliant work they're doing and the potential. Climate change is another I was going to talk about. The arts, higher education, research and training. The government has to make a statement of impact on children for every new law it brings in. If it affects them, it doesn't. But if it did, and when it does, it relies on higher education, evidence-based and statistics and reports. So we inform society at all levels, and we could do a lot more on that one. And we could particularly point out how problems for adults are serious, and sometimes they're even more serious for children. Perhaps we could discuss that. Now, how can childhood studies and the convention contribute through higher education? Well, we can point out that children are 1/3 of the world, and any discipline that's looking at society is skewed unless they're looking at children too. Over half the people in Africa are aged under 18. How can we discuss Africa instead of if we exclude children? We need more meticulous reading, careful reading of the actual text of the convention. Too many papers and chapters discuss it, and they're not talking about it at all. They haven't read it, and they're talking about a whole proliferation that goes on and on and on, starting with a paper that was written in 1990, the year after the convention. So it wouldn't really have had was actually written before 1990, published in 1990. So what does it tell us? The convention is blamed an awful lot when it is misunderstood, misread, misapplied, used as an excuse, or just ignored or overridden. It said, well, the convention doesn't do this, or the convention relies on NGOs. The convention doesn't. NGOs stepped in when people were ignoring the convention. It's a bit like blaming the food on a table if people throw it about and waste it, and saying, oh, it's bad food, when it's perfectly good food. It's people don't understand what they're doing and blame the convention very often. I was also going to talk a bit about how we could develop more real theory to show that actually rights are not just abstract ideas, they are realities as well, but maybe we could discuss that. And we could turn from looking inward into our own discipline and beliefs and the micro, private, personal troubles, which are very important, but also look outward to the public and global structures and troubles too, the powers, and connect children into the adult world of human rights. And we should also warn society that if we disrespect and exploit children now and keep them in poverty, in 20 or 40 years, when lots of you will be coming up for retirement, and I won't be here anymore probably, they'll probably turn around and say, why should we pay for you if you can't pay for our student fees and so on? And also, how are we going to have democratic, just societies? If we teach children blind obedience, they're going to end up with oligarchs. We'll end up with the 99 and the 1%. And it seems to me children's rights are one great way forward to change that.
Thank you very much, Priscilla. And thanks to all the speakers for, I think, opening up what I hope will be a very lively discussion now about the relevance of children's rights in higher education, and for us to consider questions such as, should higher education be taking more account of children's rights? What does a children's rights perspective lend to the various disciplines that Priscilla has mentioned to us? I'm going to ask the speakers to come out and join up here, if you wouldn't mind.
I'm Jonathan Hart. I work for UNICEF UK on the Rights Respecting Schools Award particularly, and we have about 3,000 schools that have this. And we've had a bit of a paradigm shift in UNICEF. We used to talk about rights and responsibilities. This question is for Afua really, and now we don't. We talk about rights and respecting the rights of others. And so my question is basically, you were talking about, I wanted to know if you really believe in an adaptation of the convention for African countries and for southern countries, whether that was something that you were agreeing with and promoting, or whether you were saying that this was not how you were thinking.
I think in terms of the example I think I gave from Nigeria, that particular NGO had realised that, in fact, in order for them to be able to talk about children's rights, they couldn't just focus on rights only, and that they had to talk about responsibilities as well. And I would say that certainly within an African context, at least the context that I know of, the attitude or the reactions of many towards the very idea of rights, or people, anyone having rights simply because they're a human being or simply because they're children, is rejected or is angrily, or people get angry about it. And so I think that there is a need, and I think there is a space, certainly within a West African context, to talk about responsibilities as well. And this is what the African Charter does do. But unfortunately, the African Charter is not as promoted, it's not as talked about, it is certainly less well known on the continent compared to the convention. But I think that in the African context, you need to talk about rights and responsibilities if you're going to enter a dialogue with people about children's rights. They don't just want to hear about children's rights. You're going to have to come in with responsibilities as well. So I think you need to think about how you engage people in dialogue, and rights alone, or leading with rights, it will make things certainly quite difficult. That's from my experience.
I think the preamble to the convention makes it very clear that rights are not selfish individualism, me. They are our rights. If ever I claim a right, it's not my right, it's ours. It's equal to everyone. And if I expect respect for my worth and dignity, it means that I'm promising to return it equally to everyone else. And the preamble says that these kind of rights, far from selfish individualism and crazy children running houses and everything, is the foundation for peace and justice in the world. And I really cannot see a better foundation and way forward. Treating people by example with respect.
Absolutely. I think, the preamble does state that. And I think a lot of the issues with the convention, it relates to its interpretation and to its implementation. And a lot of the NGOs that I worked with in Nigeria knew about the convention. They knew about its Children's Act in Nigeria, which is the domestication of the convention, but they hadn't seen it. They hadn't seen the document. Some of them had seen the Children's Act. And I think a lot of the work, a lot of the examples I'm talking about are people who have heard of the idea of children's rights. They have heard it on the radio, they've heard it on the news, but they haven't necessarily seen the convention. Okay, so I think a lot of the problems, a lot of the challenges are to do with how it's been interpreted and how it's been implemented, certainly. And I think that has led to certain reactions against the very idea of children's rights in the convention as well. So, yeah.
Sorry, can I just quickly come back on that and just say that we do believe that children should respect the rights of others, but we have, it's not contingent on them having, if they don't show themselves to be responsible, they don't lose their rights.
Yeah.
And this was something, legally, maybe our legal friend could probably help here, but is something that we realised that we couldn't go around saying that, you have to be responsible. Schools are very keen. They say, they know enough about their rights, it's their responsibilities we want to know about, and they want to use it as a school management, behaviour management tool, which we never intended for it to be that. And so that's why we dropped that responsibility aside, but we do talk about respecting the rights of others.
I think my response to you for that is that, I mean, I don't work in a UK context. The context that I work in, the value of reciprocity is so important. It binds together social relations, not just between adults and children, but between people generally. And within that context, that's where the idea of responsibilities comes in very handy when you're talking to communities, especially in rural areas, about rights, because the value of reciprocity underlines a lot of the social relationships within many communities. And I think that needs to be borne in mind when you're talking about children's rights, so.
Thank you for your patience.
My name is Rosa Maria Mendizabal. I am a PhD student. Priscilla is my supervisor. And I work in Mexico. And I can relate to that discourse because it is very common in Mexico also to say if children want to have rights, they need to have responsibilities, and that's it. But I think it is a little bit dangerous to engage with that discourse and follow that discourse, because sometimes we don't even give children the chance to participate or to have those responsibilities or those obligations if we don't see children as active participants, as people who can give to society as well. And I also see another danger because I work with preterm babies, very sick, fragile babies who we think, or it is thought that they cannot participate, they cannot say, they cannot even interact with their social environment. So where does this discourse leave these children if they are not, in our perception, interacting or adding to society? So probably, although I totally understand that discourse because I have lived it, I think we need to, I agree, change our discourse, probably go to another direction.
That was my question.
Sophia Ali Abdullah, MA Sociology and Human Rights. Afua, it's about these African communities. When you talk about participation, wouldn't you say that the big problem really is information, first of all? Both parents and children and the community need to know about the CRC and the African Charter before they actually believe whether it's for them or for the children and whether they could, compromise on these ideas. And also the fact that in a lot of African cultures, children are breadwinners. So to say that they don't put on the table, it's not quite right that they don't put food on the table, because we know they do a lot of labor on farms and everywhere else. And also this actually, the idea of this dual or triple heritage, Western colonialism, traditional African culture, and Islam. Where my father comes from, all these three interact. You had the Fulani Jihad, and then 100 years to the date, you had British colonialism. So people are actually struggling to come to terms with this, triple cultural aspects, where if you look at the House of Fulani culture, 100 years before colonialism, children actually participated fully in a lot of things in the society. Then Islam came, and that they were pushed to the background, where certain rights, because it was a matrilineal society prior to Islam, and then you had that. So wouldn't it be better to just actually, yes, you're right, to understand the cultural context, but not all cultures, either in Nigeria or in Ghana, are quite the same. They all have sort of influences from different sides.
Absolutely. I mean, in relation to your first question, in terms of information being key, I think information is key, but one of the key points I have made in the past is that even when you tell people about children's rights, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to accept it. And very often, people may find out about children's rights, they might listen to you about children's rights, and they may still decide to reject it. They might still resist against it, even once they know. So I don't think we can just assume that just by informing people, giving them that information, they will accept it. It is not necessarily going to be the outcome. And I can't remember the second question, actually. Could you just repeat that?
No, I was saying
The
something
second.
about, well, of course you have to give them the benefit of the
Yeah.
doubt. Even in the West, when you introduce CRC, like we were told at the introduction, you knew it. Not all countries have adopted that.
No.
So to say that if you tell them they're not going to, you still have to start somewhere.
Oh.
Actually telling them.
Yes, absolutely. I don't believe that. I don't think you shouldn't tell them. I think you have to understand just by telling them it does not necessarily mean that they're going to accept it. People are not passive in these things, and instead there's a need to engage in dialogue. For me, what I focus on is engaging in dialogue with communities where all the stakeholders in that dialogue are actually equal partners, and that we as children's rights activists are also listening very seriously to what those communities are telling us. And therefore the outcome of that dialogue may not necessarily be what we want. It may actually be a mixture of what the communities want and what children's rights activists want. Because children's rights has to be translated into what is meaningful for those communities.
Well, that's why I assume that it would be better to actually understand the different communities and see where they're all coming from, instead of thinking it's all West and traditional. There are other factors like religion that come into it.
Oh, absolutely.
And so basically you have to understand it from the point of view of this cultural differences. Like the Niger Delta is mostly Christian and more westernized.
Yeah.
Then you have all kinds of divisions in between.
Yeah.
And then the hardcore north, where you know about this Boko Haram who are trying to bring back like maybe 200 years back to the past into that part of the country, when they forgot that there was another culture before Islam. And so people just tend to pick and mix what they want to do.
Yeah, I totally take your point about the cultural differences, and I don't think anything I said was against that. I don't think so. But, yeah.
We just open up the conversation and see if,
Hi, Luke May Brady. I'm currently doing a PhD looking at children's participation in health services and research. And one of the things that you raised actually, May, kind of raised some questions for me around, I think the distinction between looking at ethics and methods and the convention. And I think that's something that sort of very much came up for me, and I think thinking about this whole context of children's rights in the context of academic practice. I think the ethical guidelines that I had to follow weren't as enlightened, I think, as the bureau ones can be. And I think what really struck me when I was filling in my ethics form is I'm doing participatory research about participation. And there was a bit in the form that said, does your research involve any of these vulnerable groups? One of which was children and young people, all of them. And then the next box said, if you are, justify why. And I think for me that I really had to kind of take a step back for that, because it was like the idea that actually children and young people are vulnerable and need to be protected was, definitely preference over the fact that they had a right to be heard. And I know in my previous role, I used to work at the National Children's Bureau. I did some work with some young people, and we went to talk to members of research ethics committees about participation. And again, I felt like that it was almost as if they thought there was a continuum between children needing the protection and provision rights and children being vulnerable and children having a right to be heard. And I suppose my question really is about, for those of us doing research in this area, how you can kind of work within academic systems and structures and what some of the challenges are around that, because a lot of those systems and structures preference children as vulnerable and needing to be protected and being quite risk averse.
I mean, I mentioned in my talk that when I looked at the ethics form or the risk assessment form, whatever, depending on where you do your work, it's very much at ticking boxes and then how do you mitigate this risk, and you have to come up with anything that the committee will approve of so that you can just go on and do your research. And it's once you are in the field you realize, oh my god, this was all like nonsense. Because sometimes, particularly when you work in contexts that are changing all the time, you're in the middle of it and you're like, well, I didn't mention this kind of risk. Do I have to talk to them and tell them that this came up, and does that mean that I have to go back? So there's so many issues that are not considered from an institutional perspective. And I think as students, it's our responsibility to engage critically with these procedures so that we can actually make a change as we move forward, so that it will support our work in these contexts and with children. So that highlight that children are not a vulnerable group as a whole, but in certain contexts they are. And how do you work with that? So I think it's our responsibility, our academics, practitioners, and students, to reflect on our experiences once we're back or during our field research to these ethics committees and try to make changes to these procedures so that we can try and contribute to the work for future academics and students.
And Priscilla wants to come in on the conversation as well.
Okay. Again, I think it's about history and looking back as to why that came from. If in healthcare, there was a veto on doing dangerous research with children on pharmaceuticals until it had been done on adults first, wherever possible. Then if you're going to do it on children, it's in order to benefit children that, like 2 to 5s or whatever, and specifically research them and collect the data for them. The reason is the dangers. 15 years ago, Pfizer, the pharmaceutical company, did a randomized controlled trial in Kenya on meningitis, and children died and were disabled by the experimental treatment, which was never authorized for sale in the USA. So it was far too early to have done that work. And more research, actually, medical research is being exported, outsourced into developing world countries because there are more people and there are lower standards of information and consent and also of legal control. So there's a very good reason behind that tradition. And they're simply saying, could you find out what you're doing with adults who can give fully informed consent, say no to you and be heard, unfortunately, more than children can expect to be at the moment. And your opportunity is to explain to the Ethics Committee, I have to do this research with children because they have unique and necessary knowledge, and it will add to the world's store of knowledge and so on. There are all these good reasons for doing it. Do that, because the Ethics Committees need to be updated a bit to move on from their standpoint, which is a reasonable one given the history. Would you agree or not?
Well, yes, I would, but I mean, I think absolutely. I think as somebody who's doing research in health, I sort of understand sort of in the context of clinical research and drug trials. I suppose my question was more, if because of that history, it's then moved to a system which is kind of more about protecting and I think as May was saying, more quite often a bit of a box ticking exercise where you say the things that need to be said. But actually, the real kind of ethical issues that emerge in the field aren't necessarily. Ethics is, something that goes all the way through the research. It's not kind of a bit at the beginning of the process.
Well, if it goes through one, ticking a box is part of the process. It doesn't negate the rest. And secondly, with the point about ethics is to remind all researchers, you're not just going in to do good. You're actually going in to collect things from other people, and you could upset and hurt them and humiliate and embarrass them, and you've got to think about it. Because there's such complacence among social researchers. Me do harm? Oh no, it's so nice for them to talk to me, they get so confident. Well, that's very dangerous. It's one thing to say that if you're going out to give them a service like teaching them or caring for them as a nurse. It's quite another to go and be as a collecting researcher, surely.
Yeah. Can I just say something about this as well? It's the different fields. For example, for social researchers, we do not realize the impact that we do because for clinical research, for example, you can see a tangible output. For social research, it's very difficult to assess the harm or the good you do in the field. But sometimes there are reactions in the field where it kind of stops you. For example, one of the groups I was working with, they looked at me and they were laughing, so, you're another researcher. I think Palestinian kids are the most researched kids in the world. It's like, you know what, go ahead, just do it again. Again, we're being researched, and what the hell does that mean to our lives? So it's things that happen in the field that makes you, kind of shocks you, and hopefully it will take us back to these ethics committees and ethics forums, and we reflect on our experiences. And this is how we can make a little bit of a change, I think.
I'm Rachel Burr, and I teach on the Masters in Childhood and Youth at Sussex University. It's really lovely to be here. It's lovely to see you again, Priscilla. Thank you for your time. So So I have a question really aimed at you, Cara. I've been thinking about, I teach social work students as well, so my background was social work and anthropology. And I really am enjoying what you were saying. I think it was so interesting to think about the legal perspective and how you looked after children's files and make decisions in court. So I've been in court as a social worker on the other side. And it would be very interesting to know more from you about where you are with trying to give children a voice and trying to help social workers give children a voice. Because out in the world that I'm in, my social work students and the social workers I work with in the community are stretched with capacity. We've got 40 children on our caseload. And talking to my students in the university setting about child rights is so exciting, talking about the Children Act, the 2004 Children Act. But the reality for social workers on the ground is that it's really, really hard to put that time aside. And the other point I think that I'd like to think about in relation to your work, and we've talked to you about actually afterwards, is how we give very vulnerable children a voice when no one's given them a voice and when they've had no opportunity at any point in their life to articulate anything, or even have been given so many labels in school as a result of difficult behaviour that's been misinterpreted, so that they really have so little agency. So I'd love to know more about where you are thinking about that.
I think there is, at present, there's certainly guidelines, for example. I think we always leap to the most extreme example, which is children in court speaking to the tribunal that is making the decision about them. There are guidelines about the circumstances in which judges should see children, magistrates should see children in family proceedings. There was this summer an announcement, what I felt was a slightly lukewarm announcement at a event which was the children, I'm going to get the title on, the Children and Young People's Family Justice event conference, I think, where Simon Hughes, MP, was there and said the government was announcing today its intention that children 10 and over should have the opportunity to see their the decision maker if they wanted to. And you just sort of felt, are you going to tell us what the significance of the age of 10 is, please, and what happens to everyone else below that, and should we all be cheering or should we feel slightly depressed by that? But when I was doing my master's, I did write during my dissertation of looking at the tools that already exist in the system for children to be involved in the family justice process. There are these guidelines about seeing your tribunal. There are arrangements where children can go in and see the court setting, where they write letters to judges. There is a lot of guidance there. There are things within our Children Act about presumptions about children being represented in court, and to be represented in certain kinds of court proceedings means being in the court itself. I think the reality is there's quite a lot of ignorance about those, and we all, or else people know they're there, but that's not really how we do it. That's how awful would it be if that young person was here? Imagine what it would be like, because we leap to the most extreme examples of these things. In terms of resources, I think that the harsh reality in a climate of spending cuts and huge caseloads for social workers and all of other professionals is that these children's rights issues are treated as add-ons. They're things we do if we have time. They're things that we think about if we have time. And for me, the issue is about ingraining these things in practice and understanding even what good practice actually is. I think we don't even know anymore. And when we do feel that we know, we feel that there's no time for it or there's no money for it.
Hi, I'm Usma. I'm studying a Master's at King's College in Child Studies. So children's rights is quite a new area for me, so the question may be a bit basic. I'm particularly interested in issues surrounding sort of FGM and child marriages, so I think probably a question for all of you on the panel. And I was interested in your suggestions on how to approach that subject, because I think that issue is very sensitively tied with issues of culture, and often associated with religion as well. So maybe suggestions how we could provide training to professionals or educate the community more, engage the community more? Because I don't think there's been an act, I'm not sure what act it is, but some sort of legislation where obviously FGM is illegal, but there hasn't been many sort of prosecutions in that area. So considering that the legislation has been there for quite a long time, so I just wondered whether your suggestion would be to provide training.
Which country are we, because the contexts are very different.
Yeah, no, it's quite a new area, so I was just wondering if you could give any sort of examples maybe, or how you would tackle the sort of the boundaries or situation where culture and religion are so closely intertwined. How would you approach it from a children's rights perspective? And
So maybe taking the point, if any of the speakers wanted to comment in the context that you know about.
I mean, the majority of the countries in the world, aside from Somalia and the US, have signed the UNCRC. And if you sign the convention, then you have to look at your local laws and make them equitable to whatever convention you signed, which is in this case the UNCRC. And there's always a discussion and a contention between cultural relativism and universality of human rights. So that kind of discussion is ongoing in all countries, and normally it is pushed by governments that do not want to implement human rights as kind of an excuse, saying, oh, well, our culture is against it, so we do not provide, for example, training for nurses or training for whoever is involved in that as an excuse. So it depends from one context to the other. I think in terms of FGM, and a lot of NGOs do provide training. They do provide awareness campaigns, either to the local community, women's activists, medics, but I mean, it's very, very difficult to generalize because you need to look at the context themselves. I mean, in some countries it has developed, like the situation has developed, and there are big campaigns that actually stopped FGM or limited it. In some other countries it's deteriorating because the political socioeconomic situation deteriorates. So
I was thinking more in the context of the UK and how it would
in the UK,
yeah, sort of tackle the issue here.
I think it's criminalized.
I do work on FGM, and I have written an article about it, but I don't focus on the UK. So I can certainly tell you what I think is going on in other countries, especially within the context of Africa, but the UK is not my focus. So yeah.
Sorry, I was just going to say, this is very bizarre. Before I started on an MA in early years, I was a nursing student in Tooting at the Sexual Health Centre, and a lot of the women we saw with FGM were unaware within their cultural environment that, you know, there were other aspects, you know, there was another way to be a woman. So I wonder if from the UK perspective, whether these cultural units, though, you know, you're in the UK, are still, it's sort of a taboo subject within the cultural unit, and therefore they don't understand that there are other, you know, other parts of sexual health that they are not, you know, that they're different from, I don't really want to get graphic, but, you know, they're very different from UK, you know, a white UK female who, you know, has access to that sort of service. Sorry, that's just my experience of it in the UK.
Do any of the speakers want to come up?
Can I just have one thing? I'm not sure I know a lot about this, if anything, but I do know that I recently took part in a focus group about child maltreatment, and I met someone there from the NSPCC who was involved in some recent UK-based work and changes relating to some legislative change relating to that. So I can maybe give you those details if that would help as a point of reference.
There's a question at the back, or comment.
This is mainly to Priscilla. I'm Shaman and I'm a lawyer in Sri Lanka. I used to practice in Sri Lanka representing victims of corporal punishment, mainly children. Sometimes I have been faced with this question by the judges. Haven't you ever been hit by your parents or teachers? I have been hit by my parents and teachers, and I think I'm here today because I was treated like that. And now that's just one comment. And then I come to the UK and study child rights, and then I start working in the asylum and immigration field, and I see that Home Office doesn't recognize CRC provisions, and I can't see much of a difference between the system in Sri Lanka and the UK. Now, why I'm raising this is, now it troubles me. Now we say that laws should come up from the society that it's going to be governed by, and it should be the need of the society. And then on one hand I'm thinking, has the CRC and the human rights field been imposed on certain countries when the culture of that country actually wasn't ready to accept it? Now then, when you compare the situation in the UK, where rights are almost a daily thing and where people are very much concerned and conscious of, still, if you compare the asylum regime and the CRC provisions, there's a huge gap as to whether the UK laws are compatible with the CRC standards. Even though we have the Section 55 standards where best interest of the child should be taken into consideration. So my question is, because you talked about the history of CRC, how do you see this? How do you see this gap as to the rights regime and the cultural and the athletic situation?
Well, the Convention doesn't explicitly ban corporal punishment. It talks about cruel, degrading and inhuman treatment, and it depends whether you think hitting children is that or not, and more people are, and quite a lot of countries have actually passed laws to stop corporal punishment. Most children in Britain are hit quite regularly, especially young children, so it's not particularly a UK thing. And when we say that laws should come up from society, the trouble with that view, which is a good view, is that the dominant people in society will bring up the laws, but the weak and unheard people won't get the chance to. And so we want laws of justice and equality that attend to and support the weakest people of all. And we can't just rely on kind defendants or children themselves doing all this work when there's often opposition from other people who want to keep their power and their convenience and control and think, yes, hitting's good for children. It happened to me. Very interesting book on how it's children find it very difficult to blame their parents. So if they are punished, they assume they're bad. And people seem to grow up with that rather and thank their parents for being awful to them very often. So that's another great thing to think about. That's why I added psychoanalysis as one of the great disciplines in higher education, which can give us a lot of insight into rights and reservations against rights. And in a way, you can impose by passing a law against physical punishment, which more and more countries are doing around the world, not just Western ones. But along with that, Sweden, I think, was the very first one, and they had to do lots of education and support and all sorts of things to bring that law into reality. Do you feel that Sri Lankan parents should be free to hit their children then, or
no, not at
or
all.
oh, you don't?
No. It's just that
Yes.
these are the questions sometimes
Yes.
you're faced with.
Yes.
As a lawyer, you represent a victim of corporal punishment, and then the judge asks you, haven't you ever been hit? I'm here because I was hit.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you're trying to convince someone who is totally convinced that hitting is all right.
Yeah.
So you're trying to tell that judge, pass judgment that hitting is wrong.
Yeah.
So I saw a huge gap between the cultural belief and the law or the standards that we believe that we should be following.
Can I just briefly add that maybe we should do it the other way around and say, look, you wouldn't hit adults, would you? I mean, you probably wouldn't
admit to it, and then defend why we treat children differently. And is it because they're too stupid, like dogs? Smack is the only language they understand. Well, there's enough evidence to question that.
Can I just come in and just say that actually in other countries, I don't know if Sri Lanka is one of them, but in some countries people do hit adults, people hit their wives, and they do hit other people. So within that kind, you have to understand this is the context, because in the context where you can hit your wife and it's not against the law and the police are not going to come and arrest you, then certainly hitting children is not seen as a major factor. So you'd have to address the whole societal issue.
But the more you carry on hitting children, the more wife beating is going to perpetuate as well later on.
I'm going to open it up because I know there's...
Can I just comment on that as well, just quickly? You can go back to the Convention Against Torture and define corporal punishment as torture and go about it like that.
I saw a hand over here, is that right? Oh, yeah. So last chance for 2 quick questions or comments.
Yeah, it was just a comment on the FGM thing. That I also don't know much about it, but I have picked up that is one issue where young women are leading the debate, and so I didn't like that there was some kind of allusion to the community not knowing or anything like that. I think there's been there's a whole group of young women activating, being very strong voice in the Guardian, for example, that had a voice there. So it's just a comment.
Mine was also just a comment. I'm Kate Martin. I'm also a PhD student here. And it was interesting what you were saying about the people's understanding or defence, I suppose, of hitting children. There was a campaign, I think a couple of years ago, I think it's still present, about banning smacking of children in this country. And I remember having some really quite surprising conversations actually with people who were close friends of mine, etc., who were like, well, I would support it, but but it didn't do me any harm. I was hit. And actually, when we unpicked that, actually, it wasn't that they were supportive of smacking children. It was that to almost denounce that they had to criticise their upbringing. They had to criticise their parents, and actually, that was too painful, too difficult to do. So it wasn't necessarily they agreed with hitting children, but actually, to support that meant that they had to somehow denounce the past, and that was very, very quite an emotionally laden thing to do. And what we had many a long conversation about it, and that's what we came to, was it's not about looking backwards necessarily, it's about looking forward. And actually, just because something's been acceptable in the past, and we talked a lot actually about wives being property in days gone by, and it was okay to beat them because they were the property of the husband, and actually how that's moved forward. We don't see that as acceptable anymore, but that was just the way that our conversation took its turn, I suppose, that it wasn't about necessarily just criticising the past or criticising individuals from the past, but it was about how we all agree to have different relationships in the future.
Thank you very much to all of you, to the speakers, for I think some impassioned pleas to continue thinking about children's rights, taking action for children's rights, that information is important but not enough, that laws are important but not enough. So there was the suggestion that dialogue needs to continue in terms of thinking about children's rights. In terms of work in higher education, that there needs to be more looking across disciplines, more thinking about the relationship between ethics and children's rights and how that moves throughout any research process. And I think some really critical questions about the relationship between what happens for students in university settings who are excited by the possibilities of children's rights, and bringing that into practice in a context when practice can often be, in a climate of austerity and downsizing, that can be very challenging. So how to bridge and negotiate those kinds of processes so that children's rights are embedded across the span from university to professional practice and the lives we lead with children. So thank you very much, all of you, for this. Thank you very much to the speakers. If we can give them a round of applause.